Okay, hello. What I wanted to do was I wanted to put together a series of videos of ideas that I frequently use in my practice with clients and just kind of put that out there for anyone who's interested in these ideas. I like to spend a lot of time in the beginning of therapy. I believe that the stronger the foundation that you start with in therapy, the deeper that you can get in dealing with very difficult to get at therapeutic problems. And that really is my area of specialty, is very difficult to get at and difficult to um, work through distress. So the idea of psychoeducation is that we can start by giving people information so that they understand what's happening, they feel comfortable, they feel safe, and they're in the one side of their head that typically people come to think of as therapy. Talk therapy is typically a left-brained activity. It's very intellectual, it's very thought oriented, it's very cognitively based. And we have a strong tendency in therapeutic practices to be cognitively based, but I don't think that's where the deep healing really happens. I think that we have to be able to get past the intellect in order to be able to get to the emotional, the somatic, the memory states where the trauma is stored, the experiences are stored that are creating the difficulties for us in our daily day. So I like to do that in the very beginning, talking about how to construct our inner models of thinking and through that process, how to begin a new way of introspection so that we can reorganize our psyche in a manner that is more amenable for cleaning it up. Kind of like when you do housework. You know, you would start by looking at the whole situation and then figuring out what the most doable pieces are and getting those done. So this first bit of information I call the stress-trauma continuum. By the time you're watching this, hopefully I'll have either figured out how to edit a video and we'll have it right here on the screen, or I will have posted it in the comments below. So that you can see it just like you were a client in my office. I would hand you this piece of paper so that you can look at it as I walk through these ideas. This first psychoeducational piece of the stress-trauma continuum is not very complicated. In fact, it's a lot of information that most people already know. But for many people, it initiates a process of introspection that they did not necessarily have coming into therapy. And most people find little bits and pieces of it to be new. So we have stress on one side and trauma on the other, an artificial sliding scale of experiences that can be placed on a continuum. It's really very multidimensional, but if we put it on this two-dimensional scale, we can see how stress and trauma are connected. And we start off with stress. So the human organism requires a certain amount of stress in order to function. Without it, we fall into a dysthymia or a type of cabin fever, and we just become itching for something to do. I think of a time when you may have experienced that. Perhaps that time is now. So we want a little bit of stress on the system. And not all stress is bad. Did you know that there is a type of stress that is positive stress, and it's called eustress as opposed to distress? So eustress is what we really want. And this is the type of thing that we experience when we start a new job, or we start a new relationship, or we travel somewhere we've never been, or sometimes when we do things that we have done before. We enjoy them. They're challenging to us. Learning something new is a challenge to us. It puts a demand on our resources. But we enjoy it and we look forward to it. And perhaps we even chose to bring those stressors into our life. The problem is when you get too many demands and expectations that start building up, and then we get into what we call distress. And distress is a piece of language that I use very frequently to kind of generically cover anything that we might be experiencing that we would rather not be experiencing, distress. And we know that it's distress in a stress sense because we make statements like, as soon as Friday comes, I will be finished with these work tasks. I will complete my presentation. I will turn my assignments in. All of these things will be done, right? So we can identify stress because it tends to occupy a specific point in time for us. And we can have a discernible moment where that time is finished and we are moving forward into something different. What we want is we want to find a balance between those two types of stress. We want to find something in the middle. And if you've ever been a client of mine or participated in anything that I've ever done, then you would easily recognize that I use the concept of mindful presence as a very good place that balances those two out. That's what we want to do, is we want to expand our capacity to be mindful with our feet on the ground and awareness of the breath so that we can mitigate more and more of these things. And we can experience them as a flow of events where our skills and abilities are perfectly matched to the demands and expectations of our outside world. That's ultimately what we want to get to. I also like to point out a concept of flow. And for this, I often highly recommend that people look at Csikszentmihalyi's TED Talk on flow. He's a living psychological legend. He founded a lot of modern psychological thinking, and his concepts of how human performance is optimized is heavily used in the areas of like industrial psychology. How do we take these sorts of ideas into the work environment so that we optimize output? So flow is the special state where our skills and abilities are perfectly matched to the expectations and demands of our environment, and we are optimized. And it comes along with some sort of special brain state that happens, that we actually release hormones that are responsible for runner's high. And so I'll make sure to post that in the link below so people can look over it and hear about that very special place that we want to ultimately be at from the master himself. Okay, so there's stress. And then I want to move all the way to the other side of the continuum where we have what's called big T trauma. Now, I didn't make that up. That's an EMDR term. In EMDR theory, we make a distinction between big T traumas and little t traumas. And a big T trauma is classically defined as when your life is threatened or when your way of life is threatened. That's a pretty big umbrella that typically covers quite a number of my clients and quite a number of the situations that I work with, trauma is a very, very large umbrella. The diagnosis of it is a very helpful operational definition for distress, the stressors that we have in our lives today. And so when our life is threatened and when our way of life is threatened. And actually, I want to go back to stress just really fast. And I want to point out that when we experience long, prolonged periods of stressors that do not seem to go away, that are not necessarily life-threatening, that can also become ingrained in our bodies as a form of trauma as well. And then what we have in the very middle, the meat of it, the kind of the biggest chunk of this diagram is what we call little t trauma. And this is when our needs and expectations are not met. So it isn't these big, huge, life-shattering things like big T traumas. A lot of people say, I can't possibly have a PTSD effect because I haven't had, or it wasn't as bad as, or why should I be when compared to others? It's these little T's that really got clinicians messed up. These are the real difficult pieces to work with. When we can target a big T trauma, it's more clean, it's easier in some ways to work with. But when it's compounded by these small experiences of needs and expectations not getting met, things become infinitely more complicated from my perspective. So what do we mean by needs and expectations not being met? This is what we call mostly attachment trauma. These are experiences that we have at very, very early ages of life. A lot of times they're pre-verbal, which make them even more difficult to work with. Because if we can't remember them, if we don't have access to them, because we're in our 20s, 30s, 40s, but we experienced them when we were single digits, we can't even put words to why we feel this way. We can't identify memories that go along with why we have the distress that we have in our daily life. All we can really look for are the smoke screens. So these smoke signals. So I call them smoke signals, these little tracers that kind of come up from the subconscious and the unconscious mind. And they typically tend to sound like three basic things. Again, this is straight out of EMDR theories. The first one is that I'm not lovable. I'm not lovable, there's something wrong with me, I'm not good enough. That is also similar to the second one, which has to do with responsibility. This is my fault. I should have done better. If I was better at what I did, none of this would happen. I'm the one to blame. And then the third one, which revolves around safety. This is not safe. This is not okay. I need to protect myself. And if you sit and you think about your experiences and how frequently this sort of self-talk comes up for you, then you may find that you have at least one flag. Most people have at least one that they flag, and some people have two, and some people have three. And now you can see why resolving trauma can become significantly more difficult, because you can follow each of those ideas, each of those negative cognitions is what they're called, negative beliefs about self. You can trace all of that back through the neural network like a big, huge mesh that connects to many, many memories that you have. And then you find them being reinforced through your life. You don't really understand what's happening and why these experiences continue to happen again and again and again, but they are plugged in to the neural network, to the very, very energetic fabric of your being. And so resolving at that level is how I like to think about the way that I do healing. There are several different types of attachment styles. I don't want to go too deeply into attachment disorders, but I do want to talk a little bit at this moment about it so that you can at least have an idea of what that is in your thinking. The first is a secure attachment, where you have parents who are consistent, sensitive, responsive to the needs and learning styles and personality of the child. So that could look something like noticing that a child is more interested in reading books than they are in doing puzzles, and making sure that there are some puzzles but more books. So it's a response to the child and what the child is telling the parent, and a receptivity to that. It's also listening to the child's needs as they get older and being flexible and responsive to that. So if the kid says, I want to be in Scouts, and you say, no, I don't want you to be in Scouts, I want you to do this instead, that child could end up feeling that their needs and expectations are not met. There are a lot of factors that go into that. You have to balance it out with making sure that you have enough positives, 5 positives to every one negative. So if you did want to say, no, I really want you to do this as a parent, I want you to do this as a child, you want to balance that out respectively with other things that the child does want to do. And this is how you create a secure attachment with your child. Somebody who's going to grow up, who's going to be responsive, who's going to understand who they are, who's going to be safe in the world, who's going to joyously take on challenges and opportunities for growth and learning, and who will have good social skills and just be an active presence in the world. That's a secure attachment. When you have parents who have the belief that the child should be in the other room, should be seen and not heard, who don't take the time to sit and actively participate in their child's experience of life, what you get is an emotionally distant child. You get somebody who's avoidant, who's learned that there's no point in even asking to have their needs met. They simply won't be. So why bother? A little bit more difficult than this is when one moment you have a very loving, secure parent, and then the next moment you have a parent who can be harsh or chaotic or unreliable. And we call that an ambivalent attachment. We could also call it a chaotic attachment. So it's inconsistent with a tendency towards neglect. Okay, so every parent's going to blow up, every parent's going to have trouble, every parent's going to have their moments. It's not really about being perfect as a parent. It's about knowing how to repair as a parent. That's really the most important. How do you go back and repair? How do you model for your child what it looks like to be a real human being, and then give them a way to repair the relationship so that they can regain that attachment? And actually what we find is those sorts of things, these repair models actually contribute to more secure relationships with children and then adults, right? Moving all the way through the lifespan. And then we have the last one, which is disorganized. And this is the parent who isn't present. And when they are, they're abusive. This is the worst case scenario. And it can leave us with children and adults who just have no idea how to get their needs met. They have no idea how to work their way out of a hole. All they do is struggle. And when they reach out to create relationships, they find themselves in inexorable patterns of picking people who are going to reproduce the primary attachment disorder. And if the relationship itself isn't actually doing it, then they'll perceive that the relationship is doing it. So attachment, the relationships that we form very, very early on in our childhood really form the foundation for the world that we live in as an adult. And the bulk of the work that I do with trauma, whether it looks like depression, anxiety, OCD, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, just give me the whole spectrum of diagnoses and I'll show you how that's trauma and how it can be repaired using trauma-based models. There's one more thing that I want to talk about before we leave the stress-trauma continuum. And that is the phenomenon of what I call the very good parent with capital letters, capital V, capital G, capital P. And this is a real tricky one because, the client will come and say, oh, but my parents were wonderful. I had everything I need. I drive a beautiful car. I live in a nice house. My parents are one, I can always pick up the phone. I can talk to them at any time. There is no abuse. My parents did all the right things, except that. I had to do this, I had to do that. They didn't understand this, they didn't understand that. I wasn't allowed to express my emotions. I wasn't allowed to explore my interests, blah, 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 blah. I had to do things in a very precise way. And so then you get into this really tangled thing where people don't want to think badly about their parents because they were such great parents. But without really honestly assessing the ways that their needs were not met, then it becomes very difficult to properly reorganize that and get to a place that you say, okay, well, my parents did the best that they could. So you have to kind of backtrack and be willing to say, there was some hurtful things that happened there, even though part of me knows my parents did their very best, but part of me also feels that these needs weren't met. And you have to come from that angle in order to be able to reconcile the two and put them back together and move forward in a way that you're not unconsciously trying to repeat those patterns again and again. That could look like, somebody please love me, somebody please tell me I'm good enough, somebody please make sure I'm safe, those sorts of things. So that's the stress trauma continuum, and that is the very beginning. And what I encourage you to do is to just spend a little bit of time, maybe an hour or two or a day or two. Typically what I do is I give people a week or two between sessions to walk away and start to look at your life experiences, look at things that come up, and see if you can place them along this paradigm. Is this a positive stressor, a negative stressor, a little t trauma, or a big T trauma? What's coming up for you in your timeline? And just start to monitor yourself. Just begin that process of internal monitoring if you aren't already doing it, but do it in this way. And then we will start from here on the next video. Thank you. Have a good day.